Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Sage, and I'm the Executive Director of the area, the Augmented Reality Enterprise Alliance. And welcome to our latest webinar. I'm really excited to be here today with one of our long-term area members, Scope AR, and in a really interesting and thought leadership subject area about building the perfect AR use case. So I'm really excited to listen to David at Scope AR. Just before we start, just a few quick an introduction to the area. So David, if you can move the screen forward, please. So the area, as it says, it's the only membership-funded non-profit alliance dedicated to helping accelerate the adoption of enterprise AR. So we have a real focus on enterprise AR, and it's about supporting the growth of a comprehensive ecosystem with the technology and the benefits being quite new. We're really working together to be able to drive forward the ecosystem. Next slide, please. We are currently at 63 members, and the membership actually are in three different segments. The first segments are customers or enterprises that have deployed AR or are deploying AR at the moment. So as you can see, organizations like Boeing and Bosch, ExxonMobil, and Newport News Shipbuilding. We have a bigger group of providers of AR technology, including software, hardware, consultancy, gesture control, and a whole bunch of kind of supporting technologies in the enterprise AR field. And then the third segment we call non-commercial organizations, government agencies, research institutes, universities, standards organizations. They're often on the leading edge thinking and research within enterprise AR, and bringing those organizations together to help each other. So real kind of benefit and really helps the ecosystem to move forward. Next slide, please, David. Just to explain what the area does, we have four different, what we call our strategic pillars. The first one is about delivering thought leadership content. It's about providing the information that business decision makers need to help them make informed decisions. And today's webinar is a great example of our thought leadership kind of program. The second pillar is around networking. It's about bringing the ecosystem together to learn from each other, to share those experiences, and kind of just help people not make the same mistakes or learn from other companies that have deployed AR. The third pillar is around the educate side. And what we already see, it's difficult for some of our area members to find skilled workers coming into their organizations. So we're actively working with universities to help them, anything from on the courses they're delivering, to offering guest lecturing, to placements, to setting them challenges. So anything we can do to bring the next set of skilled workers into the industry. And then finally, there's a lot of focus on helping to reduce the barriers to adoption. We see lots of prototypes and proof of concepts going on. And we're working with the area members and the wider ecosystem to look at some of the challenges. So things around security and safety, having a single set of requirements, and also delivering research and applied research that really helps all the area members drive forward their projects and solutions within enterprise AR. Okay, next slide, please, there. And just finally to mention that this is one of many webinars that we've actually delivered with our members, ranging in a whole subject area, a whole raft of subject areas. So, you know, these are available at the area portal, www.thearea.org. Please feel free to go along. There's a huge amount of information there, and be kind of really excited if you look at these webinars, or certainly come back to myself, Mark at thearea.org, with any questions or interested in membership and things like that. Okay, enough of me. David, if you could move on. So I'm really excited to introduce David, who's the Chief Customer Officer and founder of Scope AR, someone I've got to know for a number of years now, a true expert and pioneer and evangelist in the space. So I'm excited to hand over to David, who will introduce the subject and talk about how to build those perfect AR use case. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that. As you said, we've been a member of Area for a number of years now, and kind of all the work that's been going into this in terms of helping identify how organizations, can grow and scale with AR, and most importantly, measure that is really a big focus and something that's very near and dear to our heart, of course. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about really what does make a successful use case, because at the end of the day, it's one thing to sort of dip your toes in the water and start to engage in innovative technologies, but really it has to be something that's going to be successful. And so we've had a chance to learn both from our own experiences, but also our customers in terms of what that looks like. So we're going to go through that. So a bit of an agenda. We'll go through just a bit of a background on Scope AR. So for those that don't know who we are, just a bit of context around where we sort of fit into the ecosystem and our history. Talk about some real use cases from customers that we work with today, so that this isn't something that is theoretical, but you're actually looking at how do organizations use AR, how do they show value from it, and we have quite a broad range of types of customers that you'll see. And then finally, how do you do that? So it's great to understand this technology is there, and to see that it's being used. But then the question that always sits in everyone's mind is like, okay, so where do I start? I mean, I don't want to make the same mistakes that other organizations have made or reinvent the wheel. So what do I need to think about? And talk about some next steps, and we'll have a Q&A. So on that, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions, I believe in your window there that you see for GoTo, there should be a questions tab. You can type in your questions there. We'll address most of them at the end. If there's something that's super pressing that just I want to talk about at the moment, we might pause for a moment and go through that. But we'll go through some questions at the end. And also just a reminder that everybody that is signed up for this webinar will receive a recording of it as well. So that'll be available. And we will also have an ebook sent out to you from kind of a Scope AR ebook that's been put together that will share some of these thoughts for you for future use or sharing with your colleagues. Okay, so a little bit about Scope AR. We're 35 employees, founded in 2011. We have offices in Edmonton, Canada, as well as San Francisco. And we've really been one of the pioneers in implementing and developing AR technology software for the industrial space, starting out as a service company in the early days, doing projects for companies like Boeing and Philips and Toyota, and then moving on to building products that we now license to customers. Tons of success early, really seeing some great use cases, but recognizing that for this to be scalable for ourselves, but also industry, that we couldn't remain as a service company. So focused on development of some products. I'll talk a little bit about those. And our key industries are really kind of in the industries that are moving fast. So aerospace and defense, automotive manufacturing, industrial organizations. So there's many other industries that will or are seeing or will see tremendous value from AR moving forward. But these are kind of the ones that we saw that were moving faster, that had real problems they're looking to solve. So just briefly about us, I mean, depending on where you are in terms of your knowledge and journey into digital technologies and specifically around AR, maybe you've been to trade shows like Augmented World Expo or Enterprise Wearable Technology Show that we were at last week. You would kind of see that there's two types of engagements that organizations typically have around augmented reality. The most common that you hear about is kind of remote assistance, because it's relatively easy in terms of and scalable in terms of just being able to show a camera feed to someone else. And really it's about turning on your camera, being able to show it to an expert who's somewhere else, having that expert then provide some sort of digital information back to you to help improve what it is you're seeing, provide guidance. And that can be done in a number of different ways. Through our WorkLink product, for example, If you place that call to an expert, they could add annotations, arrows, highlight spheres, all in your real world view through whatever device you have. So your tablet, your smartphone, your glasses, and that information stays locked to the real world. So if your expert is somewhere else and shows you which switch to flip or which button to push, and you put your device down or you walk around and come back to it, that arrow or that circle is going to be there. So very intuitive, very easy to scale, no special hardware necessarily required, and not a lot of requirements in terms of getting started with this, so low barrier to entry. So that's why you see a lot of that, in all sorts of kind of companies that are supporting various versions of remote assistance. The other type of augmented reality that you typically see, but it's a little bit more work, and organizations need to understand a bit more, is around work instructions. So the ability to overlay step-by-step guided instructions, instead of having something like paper instructions, you can now replace those with a step-by-step, animated content. So if you're looking at a piece of equipment and you could actually see the bolts come off of it, maybe the head assembly come off, or doing some work on an automobile, something like that, that's all kept up to date. It's best practices, shows the worker exactly what to do, and we'll go through a few use cases of those. So we have a software that allows our customers to build those instructions, and that's the really hard part. So we've made it very easy for customers to actually engage in building AR work instructions. So that's WorkLink. It provides the ability to do both of those functionalities in one, so remote assistance and guided instructions. Really, the focus that we have as a company is essentially just making everybody an expert. Everybody's struggling with the same challenges in terms of, an aging workforce, technology is getting more complicated than ever before, and you need to build efficiency in what it is that you do. And that is entirely the focus of Scope AR, is just building that knowledge base and putting best practices into the hands of the workers so that they know that they're doing things correctly when they need to do it, and that you can verify they've done it correctly. So taking that knowledge from your experts and just making it available to workers, no matter where they are. I mean, it's unrealistic to expect that you're going to train somebody on everything they're going to encounter. They have best practices, and that's really what we're focused on. So we have a number of different areas that we, see our technology being applied, for manufacturing and quality assurance, something like the Orion shuttle that you see there on the left that we'll talk more about later, to training and safety. So maybe installation and doing some training on operation of a piece of equipment. So industrial manufacturers, to maintenance and field service as well. And that's where we can get into all sorts of manufacturing environments, field environments, organizations that have workforces that are dispersed, and how do you make sure that they're always doing work correctly. So a little, just kind of a glimpse at how the architecture, for example, works with Scope AR. On the left-hand side, you can see that we have our authoring software. And for those that are kind of wondering, okay, what does that mean? Something like having PowerPoint in your computer to create a presentation. Instead of that, you would have a WorkLink Create on your computer, and that would allow you to very easily create those types of guided instructions that I was referring to. So all sorts of functionalities in those, from checklists and workflow and photos and recordings and everything else. When an author publishes those, so they're finished a project and they publish it, goes to the cloud and it's stored there. And that could be both an on-prem or a cloud environment. So that allows the technician to then access those instructions. And like I said, along with that, the technician can also use remote assistance to call for help. So maybe they're in a set of work instructions and need some advice, and they can call an expert that's somewhere else and get that live support. It is, I think it's also important to point out down at the bottom right there, it shows various platforms that we support, and we are generally, hardware or platform agnostic. So iOS, Android, and Windows, and we support a variation of different wearables as well as handhelds, so your phones and your tablets. And that's really important. I mean, technology needs to be easy to use, and when it's something that you can engage in without having to have special hardware, for example, that makes it something that not only is scalable, but also your technicians and your users will adopt. So like I mentioned, the focus is really around best practices and knowledge management. So we kind of consider what we do in terms of helping organizations create that knowledge base. And that starts with something like Workling Create, where you can create instructions, you can publish them and make them available to a variety of different audiences and technicians, and you can sort those into various groups as to who should access what. You know that they have the data, the information to complete some sort of procedure correctly, but then you can also verify and measure that they've actually done that correctly. So all of that data is then stored back into the server, into the CMS, so that you can, verify the maybe who accessed those instructions, when and where. The devices they were on, import information like checklists, photos, recordings, and whether they made a call. So that allows you then as an organization to not only make that content available to other workers, but also potentially make modifications and republish. And that's one of the biggest challenges with current ways of methods of doing things like paper instructions, is that those instructions can be outdated very quickly. Not to mention the fact that nobody's going to read them. So it really is a life cycle. It's all about maintaining that knowledge base, updating it, and making it available to your workforce. Okay, so just kind of getting into a little bit about what organizations are thinking about and going through right now. And there's definitely a digital transformation that's occurring in every industry. And so that's a whole bunch of things, from digital manufacturing and digital information. Could be everything from IoT data, cloud information, artificial intelligence, machine learning, VR, AR. It's a whole strategy organizations are going through to understand how they can provide best practices to their workers. And AR is really that end piece of just visualizing it or providing the tools to show a worker what to do. So everybody's going through this. It's certainly not a matter of if this is going to happen in your industry. It absolutely is. It's just a matter of where you are on the curve of sort of adopting that. And the main driver for that, as I mentioned, is really around the fact that there's a changing workforce. There's a cultural shift that's occurring. There's a major skills gap that's identified as talent changes, and it's a major issue. I mean, most organizations are actually looking to fill roles, but not just fill roles, but they want to fill them with the right people. They want to fill them with workers that have the skills to actually complete tasks correctly. And that's where something like AR can provide a lot of value in that workforce. So not only are you relying on training and experience, but you're also ensuring that they have those best practices regardless of where they are. So it's really about empowering the worker with knowledge and best practices that they might not have without something like augmented reality. And this is certainly just eye-opening when 6 out of 10 manufacturing job openings are due to a skills shortage. So just continues to highlight, regardless of what industry it is, that there is a shortage in skills, and employers want skilled laborers. They don't want just any laborers. So if we can ensure that workers have those skills because it's being shown to them, and you can verify it's being done correctly, that's a huge advantage. And really, I mean, augmented reality is something that we see in all sorts of stages of the various organizations. So it could be field service, where you're supporting workers that are out in the field. Training is a big area, so especially on new equipment, maybe you can't always have the equipment in front of you, but can you place a holographic view of it in front of you so that you can actually go through training before you get to the equipment? Could it be operations, where once you're out of the field, you're actually now seeing those same instructions right onto the equipment? Manufacturing is a big area as well, and there's all sorts of areas in manufacturing. In fact, it's probably one of our primary targets is in terms of customers that we're seeing engage rapidly in this type of technology. So it's, like I said, there's all sorts of different areas that you can focus. It's a matter of finding the right use case and trying not to do too much at once. And that's really what we're going to get into right away. But before we do that, just to give you context around some of the customers that are currently engaging in our Worklink platforms and the value they're seeing, we'll go through a couple examples and very different types of customers. So the first one is around Prince Castle. Many of you probably have never heard of them. but also many of you on this call have used their products today or been part of using their products. So they manufacture industrial kitchen equipment for stores like McDonald's and Burger King. So something like a bun toaster. And they have a very real problem in that when the bun toasters have an issue, the McDonald's store will call and say, we have, some sort of maintenance issue with this. And Prince Castle will send out a contract worker. The contract worker is very skilled, but generalist. So they need to go out there, first of all, try and understand what the problem is. Then they need to try and fix it. And all too often, the technician or the store will call back in a few days and say, we're having the same problem. And sometimes they'll have 20 or 30 tickets associated with a single piece of equipment. So that's a major concern for somebody like Prince Castle who wants to keep McDonald's very happy and show proper customer support. So they've started using WorkLink remote support last year to identify where that gap was. And what they realized is that the first stage of that was they weren't diagnosing the problem properly. So a technician will go on site, but they're not the experts. So by using remote assistance through WorkLink, they can connect to an expert who's somewhere else. That expert can actually ask questions, show the worker what to do, or even at times the store manager, and they can diagnose what the problem is. So from that point, the technician can then go to the site. They have the proper tools, the proper equipment, and the proper knowledge to complete the task correctly. And if need be, call back to the expert for some support. So, dramatic improvements in terms of 100% first-time diagnose rate, which, as you can see, eliminates service trips by 50% and reduces labor spend by 50 to 85%. So, that's an example of a field service application with, really significant return. Unilever, so, a very, very large manufacturing company that also works with our products. I actually use both, tools within the WorkLink product. So work instructions to make sure that workers were completing tasks correctly and often simple things. I mean, something like replacement of a seal in a compressor that keeps, a cooler cold at one of their ice cream factories. The replacement of this seal wasn't complicated, but for whatever reason, it was being done incorrectly all too often and causing, the compressor to go down and the ice cream to melt and very, very significant cost reduction. They were using WorkLink to try and see if this is a way that they can improve the workers' procedures, make sure they have best practices, and really significant improvements on basic tasks. So it doesn't have to be something that's overly complicated. It has to be something that they've identified as a problem, and it has to have some sort of pretty high value to them. And the value is the cost to that factory when that cooler goes down. So very significant. And the big issue is they're seeing that they're losing an enormous amount of knowledge over the next few years within a single factory. Now you multiply that by the 250 factories that Unilever has, and there's a crisis occurring. So they are actively engaged in saying, how do we actually use technology to make sure that we can harness that knowledge and deliver it to the workforce? Using something like remote AR, for example, again, the same type of thing, or sorry, not remote AR, but remote assistance through our WorkLink product, the same type of thing. So, an expert could even be on site, but the cost of getting that worker through the clean room and into the factory floor to do some sort of diagnosis and replace or do some sort of repair is quite expensive, especially when you're thinking about the downtime of a factory line. So by being able to use remote assistance through WorkLink in terms of seeing exactly what that worker is seeing on the floor, and at times being able to fix it very quickly, again, really significant improvement in terms of the downtime, reducing the downtime of the factory line. So when they can reduce that downtime, the costs in manufacturing are tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour, depending on what they're doing. So really significant. We've gone through field service, manufacturing, and then the third use case in a customer that's very high profile for us is Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is currently doing development and construction of the Orion shuttle for NASA that's going to go to Mars. So really cool, really high profile project, but really, really significant gains by them. So This is a photo that's taken from another person that you don't see here wearing a Microsoft HoloLens and looking at the Orion shuttle where they've overlaid the 3D content right onto the heat shields of the shuttle. And just to give you context of what's going on, what they selected was fasteners as something that they can improve the process on through augmented reality. So very difficult to try and translate paper instructions to the real world. So what they're doing is just showing the workers. All the fasteners in blue, they tighten to one torque setting. In green, to a different torque setting. In red, it would be to another torque setting. And when you look at the improvements that they're seeing, is they're seeing up to 99% reduction in information overhead. And I'll explain what that is in just a moment, but terrific improvements in terms of speed of doing the work, costs of technicians, and efficiency and actually training as well. So really massive improvements in the right use case. And that's not to suggest that Lockheed Martin is going to all of a sudden implement augmented reality work instructions into everything they do. It needs to be the right use case. But when they do, tremendous value. And really what they did, and I'll go through this just briefly, is reduced, it's called the time to information. If you can imagine the complexity of looking at paper instructions and then try and orient that to the real world and then decide if you're doing it right, that actually takes a lot of time. As you could see by doing something like holding up a tablet or looking through Microsoft HoloLens, you can actually look at the real world and all of that information is right there. So that's how they're seeing such significant improvements in reduction of time to information in that OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and finally doing the actual act itself of tightening those fasteners. So really significant improvements, whether you're talking about a bun toaster that's in a McDonald's, a manufacturing line, or building a space shuttle, right? It's got to be the right use case, and that's kind of what we're going to get into next. So the key ingredients for what we would consider successful use case, because you're sitting there right now and thinking, okay, I've got all these ideas of what we should do, and some of them are probably practical. Some of them probably aren't. Some of them might need, some improvements in technology, maybe hardware, maybe computer vision, maybe the software before it's going to be successful. So I'm sure they're all relevant, but really the focus is, how do I identify something that does make sense? Where do I start? And that's the key point for all three of those customers. They didn't try and do too much off the start. They identified one use case that was very specific, showed tremendous value on it, and then they're able to say, okay, now we've learned from this, let's scale, let's find other use cases that we can apply this to that have similar characteristics. So going through what you need to do to identify that use case, first of all, is there a real problem, right? It's not about just bringing a technology in, trying it out and kicking tires and then finding out if there's like a use case afterwards. That generally doesn't end up in saying we achieved this outcome. It really does start with the business unit saying, hey, here's something we have a problem with. It's costing us this much time and this much money. Can we improve this? And if we do, what improvements are we going to show? That really has to be the starting point. And without that, you're not going to find the results you're looking for to say, this is the success I had. So is it measurable? Time, safety, money, whatever it might be, there has to be some sort of metric for that. Once you have that, and perhaps augmented reality is the solution, perhaps it's not. If you feel like providing best practices is the right approach, is it repeatable? Am I going to go with guided instructions, or is it something that's kind of specific and I'm going to use remote support? And if it is specific, maybe after a certain number of times, we realize that we have the same question being asked, and therefore we can build guided instructions. Again, going back to building that knowledge database, that library of instructions and content and information that can then be delivered to other workers. One of the big questions that comes up is, can I use it outside? Can I use it down in a basement in a dark, dirty place? Well, sometimes. I mean, it really depends on who the worker is and what hardware makes the most sense. But you really have to be honest about, and so should your partner, whether it's a hardware provider or a software company like ourselves, about where it's going to work. So if you said, can I take that HoloLens outside and use your software to walk around a plane and see the same sorts of things as the Orion shuttle? Probably not, because the HoloLens doesn't work great right now in really bright environments. So find the right use cases. And when you do, then you can actually say this is something that we're going to be successful in. Do you have the required buy-in? So you might have a great use case and you might know that it's going to work and you might know what you want to do. But do you have the required buy-in from management, from IT, from security, and honestly from the end user? So what that means is it easy? So if you go to the effort of deploying this and investing money and time and energy, you need to make sure that's something that the user is going to be accepting of in terms of, you know, what the application is. Now, not everybody is going to use something like you saw with the Orion shuttle, where it's the HoloLens. If you give that HoloLens to a technician working on a bun toaster, they wouldn't really know what to do with it. So in the case of a worker who's willing to take the time to learn it, like for Lockheed Martin, absolutely, that's then easy for them. In other work situations like the bun toaster, easy for them is holding up their phone or their tablet because they know how to use that device. So is it easy is all relative, but you need to make sure you've got user buy-in. And obviously, does the math work? And I mean, that's a big question that always comes up. You know, what does it cost? Well, the cost is obviously important, but not as important as the ROI. If you're spending $100 on something, but it's only saving you 10, that doesn't make much sense. If you're spending $50,000 on something, but it's saving you $1 million, well, that makes a lot of sense. So really need to go through and figure out exactly what the improvement's going to be and how you measure that, and does the math work in terms of saving the organization time and money. You know, and finally, is it scalable? You know, where are you at in terms of hardware? Is it something that needs some improvements? Does it need, you know, something like HoloLens 2? Is it something that you need a monocular device for? Is it something that's going to be an environment that's conducive to safety and everything else that goes along with that? And how has change management been addressed? So those are all questions. It's great to put it into, you know, a small use case to show success, but can you scale it within the organization? So these are some of the lessons that we've learned, you know, in terms of working with organizations in the various industries that we work in. This is the checklist of questions we kind of go through to say, is this a good use case? And if you can check these boxes, I can guarantee that that use case is going to be successful. And as a company, a software company, we help make sure that it is with them. And from there, that's how you see organizations like Unilever, like Prince Castle, like Lockheed Martin start to scale beyond that single use case. So next steps, just kind of summarizing what we went through. I mean, spend time to develop your use case, go through those checklists, make sure that you don't just, you know, try something for the sake of trying it, but understand why. Put in a timeline, know what is mutually kind of agreed upon between you and your software and hardware vendors, and identify all the stakeholders and really who's accountable for driving this from every party that's involved in it. And honestly, this is something that we know is super important, is including IT and security from the very start. Make sure everybody's engaged in it, make sure you've got the buy-in from everybody in your organization in order to achieve the results and ultimately the ROI you want. So yeah, I think we're probably coming up on about 10 minutes left in our presentation here. So, you know, certainly at this point, be happy to answer any questions that that might have come up.
Hi, David. This is Mark. So we've had a number of questions come up from the audience or the attendees. So let's pick one here. Okay. So the AR solutions I have seen all seem to focus on bringing info in or stroke instructions to the worker. Is anyone using AR to capture information from the worker to make their systems smarter?
Yeah, a great question, actually. I mean, you're really focused on sort of the next steps in the evolution of AR. And from our view, this is about building the knowledge database. So currently, you know, we have features like photos, like session recordings. Those types of things can document the work that a worker is doing and allow other workers to actually access that information. Now there's a whole next evolution to this when you think of IoT, real-time integrations with things like AI and data and machine learning that then can help actually take that information and probably identify what work needs to be done next. The other aspect to it, when you think of something like real-time capture of a worker going through either work instructions or real-time support is being able to, let's say, replay that information back onto the real world at a later date. Part of that is a bit of an evolution of computer vision and making sure that cameras can easily recognize a specific location, and that's not far off. So when we talk about session recording and how we record the different streams of data, really it is about being scalable, and that means recording the sessions and then being able to replay them in the same spot to give the next worker that same information that has already gone through. So as opposed to necessarily having to author and in a software, authoring could also mean that real-time investment from a worker and then being able to replay that information back. So the answer is we're at the kind of first stages of doing that with photos and session recording, but there's a lot more evolution that needs to happen to get to the point where it's being truly scaled, I would say.
Okay, thank you, David. Let me have a look. There's a similar kind of question here. So you mentioned that there is a user-facing software to build videos. Does Scope AI also provide customized solutions where you guys build the content for the company?
Yeah, good question, and absolutely, we do have a creative services team, and that's sort of where we started, in the early days, was building those custom projects. Fortunately, because we have WorkLink Create, we can also build those now with our creative services team quite rapidly. So a project that would have taken us, weeks or months to build in the past can be built in hours or days now. So we absolutely do, and a lot of organizations want to get started in this journey, but they don't necessarily have the internal resources to say, we're going to have an author as much as easy as your software is, because, just to be clear, there's no coding, no programming. Anybody on the call today could use it, but as easy as it is, we just may not have the resources to dedicate to that. So can Scope AI do that? And absolutely, our creative services team does that all the time. Which I think is a really important part of the customer journey, as I call it. This isn't like, licensing, Microsoft product to you for, that we just license and say good luck. This is really about once you have our software, our creative services team investing a lot of time into making sure that your use cases, that your use of the software itself is going to be successful. And we really enter it as a partnership, whether we're doing the authoring for you maybe off the start, or just working alongside you.
Okay, thank you, David, for that. I think another question that I'm sure you covered, but just to re-emphasize, the question is, does your remote assistance work with any headset apart from the HoloLens, or is it just for tablets and smartphones?
Yeah, good question. In the past, we've supported all sorts of wearables. I think in the number of years back, it was things like Epson, which was the first kind of glasses that came out, and then evolved onto things like ODG, and then RealWear we've supported, and then of course HoloLens. So the question is, I would say, a constantly evolving question, because as new hardware comes out that makes sense for our products, we would support those as well. So it really comes down to what the customers are asking for. The nice thing is when you use our remote assistants or you author projects in WorkLink and they're available sort of on that cloud environment, as new hardware comes out, you don't have to do anything special. If we support the hardware, it'll just work on those devices as well.
Cool, thank you. And kind of following on from that, have you used the HoloLens too? And if so, has it changed what you're able to do?
Yes and yes. So we were one of the first two companies to actually have and view a HoloLens 2. I can tell you there is pretty significant improvements, and we're very excited that we're supporting it, and we're looking forward to getting it out there. We're actually an official, I think, partner reseller to them as well. So yeah, it's going to be something that I think is going to certainly change the way that a lot of our customers do their work.
Okay, perfect. Let me just have a look at some of these others. I think we've answered a number of questions with that one. Do content authors need Unity? There's a quick little question in there.
Yeah, good question. I think about 95% of all AR content is based on the Unity rendering engine. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's typically used in the gaming industry and it's a very powerfully supported tool. So yes, WorkLink is based on Unity for us, which is in some people's mind good and some people's mind bad. Good because those that do know how to use it, I mean, it just gives them maybe a little bit of a leg up, but not really. You don't need to use a single Unity tool within our WorkLink Create software. Everything is 100% custom WorkLink. Unity is the rendering engine behind it.
Perfect. Okay, I think we've got a chance for one more question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So the question is, how long do you find the best kind of pilot use case or use cases last?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that the answer to that is as long as it takes to have something that's measurable. It's important to make sure that a pilot isn't just doing something at random because you want to do something, but it's actually going to be something that you can measure and say, look what we did. But it's also important in a pilot to have, you know, sort of a timeline that's as tight as possible, that everyone is mutually committed, that you don't start until you're ready, that you know what you're measuring, and that everybody's involved. And I don't mean just from, you know, a company like ourselves and the person you're working with, but all the stakeholders are understanding of what the goal is of that pilot. And that takes some work to get there, right? So often that's the longest part of the pilot, is getting everybody engaged. But from the time you actually start the pilot to finish the pilot, I mean, that should be as short as possible. We've seen it in weeks to, you know, maybe up to 2 or 3 months would be a bit on the longer side of what we'd recommend. But yeah, it's honestly that work up front that keeps that pilot short, and make sure that when you get to the end of it, that if you show the results you want, that you can then move into that next stage.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed, David. I want to thank you very much for a really insightful webinar. I think there's been lots of great information. Yeah, David, if I hand over to you to say the last few words and remind people that they're going to get the recording, and then we can close down.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. I really appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy days to listen in. Hopefully this was informative for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Mark at Area. And as mentioned, you'll receive a recording of this as well as a digital handbook that will be sent to you from Scope AR on some of the use case selection criteria that we talked about.
Fantastic, thank you, David. And just anybody we haven't had time to answer the questions, we will get back to you with an answer as well. So my apologies, we couldn't cover it all. So David, thank you again. Thank you everybody for listening, and say keep in tune for future Area webinars as well. And thank you very much and goodbye.